할렐루야 사랑교회, 우리 주 예수 그리스도 이름으로 인사를 드립니다. I bring you greetings from Grace Community Church in Fulton, Maryland. Last February, we had 오정현 목사님 to us to preach. 너무 은혜가 받았습니다. You are quite the hit here, Reverend O, and we hope that you'll come back again to be with us. It's a joy to be with you today on this revival week after Easter. My heart is so encouraged to know that you are gathered together for this week because you believe that Jesus is alive. I want to start today by telling you the story of Florence Chadwick. She was an amazing swimmer. In fact, she was the first woman to swim across the English Channel both ways. In 1952, Florence Chadwick decided that she was going to swim from Catalina Island off the coast of California and make that swim across the channel. It was only a little bit longer than the English Channel. It was about 42 kilometers. So she started out, and her mother was in a boat alongside her, and they were just traveling together. She was being encouraged, and 15 hours into the swim, a deep and heavy fog set in over the ocean. Florence Chadwick began to lose her way. She began to not see where she was going, and only an hour after that fog set in, she gave up. She quit. News broadcasters were very confused. They wondered and they were curious about why she would surrender so easily. In fact, the most tragic thing was that she stopped only 1.5 kilometers from the shore. Florence's response was that if I could have just seen the shore, I would have made it. 2 months later, she came back and she completed that swim, even with fog, because she had a vision of the shore. What is your vision for life? How are you living today? There's a lot of fog in the world we live in, isn't there? Political worries, economic uncertainties, the generational challenges that I know are on everyone's minds and thoughts. Many of you are going through family hardships. Maybe you're battling a sickness or an illness. You are in a fog and you are having trouble seeing. Maybe even that's why you're here this week. I pray that God would give you vision for how to live meaningfully and purposefully in this short time we have on this earth. This morning, I want to take you to a portion of the Bible that speaks to the fog of life. In fact, the overall message of the book is how to live in a life that is unpredictable and temporary. One of the Hebrew words that repeats through Ecclesiastes is the Hebrew word hevel. Hevel. It's actually in the opening and closing of the book in chapters 1, verse 2 and 12, verse 8. In Korean, it reads, 전도자가 가로되 헛되고 헛되며 헛되고 헛되니 모든 것이 헛되도다. In your Korean Bible, hevel in Hebrew is translated 헛되. The Hebrew word actually has a slightly different meaning though. It's the idea of mist, 습기. It means something temporary, here today, gone tomorrow. Life is hevel, the writer says. It's temporary. But hevel also has the idea of something confusing, something that doesn't make sense. It doesn't go the way you think it should. Have you ever experienced that in life? For instance, the writer of Ecclesiastes, he observes, a righteous person suffers while a wicked person prospers. Or a wise, skillful worker dies and then has to leave all of his work to someone who is not wise and didn't earn it. These kinds of mysteries are what make life hevel. In chapter 4 that we're going to look at this morning, he has some more observations. In fact, look at it with me in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. He says, again, I observed all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of those who are oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. Power is with those who oppress them. They have no one to comfort them. So I commended the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive. But better than either of them is the one who has not yet existed, who has not seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. He sees a life filled with hardships and oppression, frustrations, There's no one to comfort those who suffer, because even the power to change your situation is with those who are making you suffer. His observation is that life is hard. It's not less hard for the believer in Jesus Christ. We don't get to escape the hardships. In fact, keep reading with me in Ecclesiastes 4:7-12. Again, I saw futility, hevel, under the sun. And this in Hebrew is very important. It says, there is a one without a second. That two and one is a repeating theme through this passage. Without even a son or brother, and though there is no end to all his struggles, his eyes are still not content with riches. Who am I struggling for, he asks, and depriving myself of good things? This too is futile and a miserable task. So what does he see about the way that we work and the way that we struggle and labor? He sees, did you catch it in verse 7? That it arises from jealousy. Jealousy, competition with our neighbor, 경쟁. In fact, I have 5 children, and my 2 littlest ones, oftentimes they'll go out with 할머니 or 할아버지, and they'll have a wonderful day by themselves. They'll get to eat and play, and no matter how good of a day they have had, the minute they come in the house, do you know what the first question they ask? What did my brothers and sisters do today? They are trying to weigh and understand their own happiness by comparing to what their brother or their sister did that day. To live in competition like this is such an exhausting way to live. You always have to look over your shoulder. You can never be content because someone is always in front of you that you want to catch, or there's someone always coming behind you who wants to catch you. The writer says, be careful of competition, the jealousy that causes us to drive and work and work. But he also says, be careful of isolation. In verse 7-8, he says that there is a one without a second. Absolutely. But we get this picture of a single person working so hard, a driven, solo person. The vision is to achieve and succeed. And did you catch this right here? It says, his eyes are still not content with riches. He's never satisfied. So many struggles, so much work, and yet never satisfied. Then one moment in verse 8, this person asks the question, who am I struggling for? Depriving myself of good things. What he's saying is to work that hard out of competition and an insatiable appetite and to have no one to share it with, this is hevel, confusing. So the Bible suggests a better way. In verse 9-12, he gives us a different picture of 2 and 1. Look at it with me. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their efforts. For if one falls, his companion can lift him up. But pity the one who falls without the second to lift him up. And if 2 lie down together, they can keep warm. But how can the one alone keep warm? And if someone overpowers the one, 2 can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. In contrast to the person who's striving alone, imagine the person who has a partner, a friend. Verse 9 says there's a good reward for their work. And in fact, life is going to get hard. Remember what he said earlier? Life is hard. But if you have another, you can face it together. In verse 10, it says there's help. If one falls, the other can help him up. In verse 11, it says if you meet a foe, you can defend against an enemy. Isn't it interesting that we live in a world where we have all of these devices, all of these phones that keep us more connected than ever, but loneliness is an epidemic. We are facing a loneliness like we've never faced before. And here the Word of God tells us 2 are better than 1. Let me ask you, how do you want to live? Do you want to live in competition and jealousy or in community? There's an African proverb. It says this, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. But if you want to go far, go together. So as I close, how can we live this way? I want to give you 2 thoughts. One of the first things, if we really want to live in our work and in our loving one another in meaningful ways in the midst of a life that is hard and uncertain, the first thing we have to do is learn to live in the cycle of grace. What do I mean by that? You see, in English, we have a word for somebody who can't stop working. We call them a workaholic. That idea has the idea of somebody who is addicted to work, a 중독 to their work. Actually, though, workaholics are not addicted to their work. They are addicted to the success that their work promises and achieves, the approval, the recognition. And there's actually a cycle to this. You see, we start working and we get our identity from our work. And that causes us to drive to be successful so that we can get acceptance and approval from the people who are seeing what we have achieved. The challenge with this is that no matter how big your achievement, over time people forget. They forget how great you are. And so you have to work harder to reestablish a stronger identity for more approval and success. And you have to go again and again and again and again. See, at the core of our addiction to success is our desire for approval. And when we seek it from our work, we have to keep going and going and going because our approval is hevel, temporary. The gospel of Jesus Christ calls us into a different cycle, a new one, because of what Jesus did for us. So you see, he died on the cross for all of our sins, the very reasons why we didn't deserve acceptance or approval to begin with. And when we put our trust in him, God gives us the approval that Jesus has earned for us. It's transferred to you and to me. So we start out our work with approval that comes from what God has done for us. When we have the approval from the love of God, what it does is it causes us to be dependent upon God, for God to give us his mercy, his wisdom for the work that we have to do. We get our identity from being a son, a daughter of God, not an employee of God. And that causes us to work hard, to work faithfully, to work diligently. And out of that work comes fruitfulness. And from the fruitfulness reminds us of the love that God has for us, our approval, and the cycle begins again. We don't have to be in competition with others because God provides for us and motivates our hard work. And that allows us to live as redwoods. Do you know what a redwood tree is? California is famous for redwood trees. They are massive trees. They can grow to over 100 meters high over hundreds of years. And the crazy thing is that as high as those trees are, their roots are very shallow, only about 1.5 meters deep. So how do they stand so tall, even when the winds and the storms come, and not fall over with such shallow roots? Well, it's because you will never find redwood trees growing alone. They always grow in groves or clusters. And the reason is because those shallow roots, they intertwine. They are interconnected. In fact, they overlap so much that it becomes one giant root system that holds them all up together. This gives them a strong base when life is hard. How about you? Who are your roots intertwined with? Life is hard. We were not meant to walk it alone. If you want to see through the fog of life, look around. Who are the people of God that he has brought into your life to know him? Living, laboring, not out of competition, but companionship, in relationship, in friendship. You see, Ecclesiastes 4 is the invitation in the midst of a broken world to receive the gift of God, one who holds us in the storms and oftentimes comes to us through the gift of relationships. There's so many times in my own life where I've experienced the deep love of Jesus, not alone, but through the timely encouragements of friends, the tender presence of my wife, not alone, but in community. This is why we need the church. This is why we need each other. So 사랑교회, may you live in and work in the cycle of grace. There are so many challenges ahead of all of us as we live in this world. May God raise up and send laborers into all areas of business and employment who work from approval from God, not for approval. May God give to Sarang Church the grace to cultivate deep relationships, friendships. In fact, pray for such friendships and relationships. Are you lonely today? Pray that God would send to you a godly man or woman who would better walk alongside you as you pursue Jesus. You don't need a lot of these kind of friendships. You just need one or two. And as you ask God for this, look for his answer. In fact, look to be the answer to somebody else. May God raise up at Sarang Church a forest of redwoods who are united by their love for Jesus and their love for one another, not in competition, 경쟁, but in deep fellowship, 교제, for the purpose and the mission of the glory of God. The Lord's blessing upon you today.